In the previous video, we managed to enable our server to render some data from the API by setting up an EJS template and a middleware that intercept all client requests and stringify the data from the API inside the template. Now, to make the app universal, we need to implement our code in a way that enables Redux to get the initial state from the server and React Router to be capable to provide the right React component to be rendered to the server based on the client request. Alright, firstly, we need to move the routes from client.js into a separate module so they can be shared and used by the server. To do this, we can duplicate client.js and rename the new file routes.js. We need a module that only provides the routes. So I removed the provider tag, and maybe it is better to write our constant without the capital letter to avoid confusion with the components. Then we export default and routes. Then I remove all Redux related stuff. And now back in client.js, I remove all React Router tags, import the routes module, and we use routes in place of the tags. We then remove all the components import statements. Last thing to implement in the client is to get the initial state for the Redux store, but this time from the server, which then passes it to the store in the client. Hope you got this important concept. The server provides the initial data and renders it. We therefore need to update the state with this initial data from the server. Windows.initialState is a global variable that we will set in the server in a moment. We can now go back and complete the implementation in the request handler module. To make easier to understand, I already wrote the necessary steps in comments. And as you can see, we need to implement a Redux store and React Router on the server. So let's remove the two lines of code I used to show you how the server-side rendering is implemented. And then we import all components we need. So we need React, create store from Redux, provider from React Redux, render to string method from React DOM server, and this method allows us to render React components to a string. And then we also import match and router context from React Router. These are the methods you use to enable React Router in the server. Alright, now we are ready to cover all steps. Firstly, we create the store. In order to create the store, we need the reducers and some initial data. So we import the reducers, and by the way, we also need to import the routes we just created, and the initial state will be an object that contains a books object of books array, and the array will come from the API response. Now we need to stringify the initial state so we can pass it to the client through the windows.initialState global variable. We need to be careful when we allow front-end code to run in the server. We could be exposed to JavaScript injection attacks. Here we can mitigate the risk by escaping scripts tag, but the greatest defense will be a careful validation of any input from any form in the front end. So be careful when you will implement the validation of the forms in your website if you are going to use server-side rendering. Now, last step here is to implement the routing. We will use the React Router match method, which accepts two parameters. The first one is a configuration object with the routes and the requested URLs. And the second is a callback that determines what to do when a route is matched. So as we said, we write the configuration object that contains the same routes as the client and the location which takes the user requested URL. Let's now implement the callback. If the match returns an error, we capture in the server status and send an error message. If match finds a redirect, it will redirect to the specified location. And if find a component, it will render to string the component by passing the provider and all necessary props. The way we render the component is to pass it to the template, as we did in the previous video. We will also pass the initial state to the index, so we can make it available to the client. Finally, if no any match is found, we send a 404 page not found. And alright, now we just need to implement the tags in our EJS template. Make sure there are no blank spaces around the React component tag, because React will throw an error. We then add the script tag and pass the initial state to the global variable. And now I save and refresh, and awesome, is working. In my browser, JavaScript is disabled, but the page is rendered anyway. You can see that my JavaScript is disabled by the fact that the Buy Now button do nothing, and so all the other buttons that need JavaScript to work. Let's now enable the JavaScript to make sure the client is kicking in as expected. And oops, I see an error. Okay, this error is basically telling me that somehow the markup generated by the server doesn't match the one from the client. I'm glad I got this error because it's one of the most common mistakes you do when implementing the server-side rendering. I basically forgot to compile the client after I made the changes in client.js. So if I run Webpack and refresh the browser, everything should work well. Awesome, it works.